So I am with Dave Brennan, director of Brephos. Really great to have you here at Speak Life.
Thanks for having me. It's a real privilege to be here.
Brilliant, brilliant. Now, Dave, we first met at a conference that you put together. When was that conference up in London?
Yeah, so October the 16th, we had a one-day conference for church leaders. Really, the aim of the conference was to help church leaders to tackle, to handle, to engage the issue of abortion in their churches.
Yes, and really that is kind of the goal of your organisation, Brephos, really to face the church and to equip the church and inspire the church, empower, and then hopefully embolden the church to move on the issue of the unborn.
Yeah.
Is that the goal?
Yeah, exactly. It's educating. So there's a lack of awareness of the issue of abortion, the facts of abortion, what the Bible has to say about abortion. And then there's an issue of equipping, training. How do we teach on this effectively, compassionately, relevantly in the days in which we live? So it's really education and equipping.
Yeah. So tell me some of your story kind of growing up. You grew up in a Christian home, is that right?
Yeah, I was very blessed to grow up in a Christian home. I made a decision for Christ very, very early on, one of my earliest memories, in fact. And for me, my faith really came alive, I suppose, at the age of 13. I read the Bible from cover to cover. That's another story. I'd heard what people said, the God of the Old Testament, it's not the same as the God of the New. I wanted to see for myself. And I was blown away by the consistency of the characterization of God. And that's for me when it really flourished. But I was in a church context, which was always, I suppose, quietly but strongly pro-life. It was an assumption growing up. But I had no idea of the facts of abortion really, and in particular how prevalent it is. And so it didn't weigh heavily, or it wasn't sort of forefront for me growing up.
What was it then that really tipped you into thinking, okay, this is the issue of our times?
I think it was really becoming aware of the scale of the issue. We've now had 9 million babies killed through abortion in our country alone over these 5 decades, and
since 67,
since 67,
is really
since the legalization of abortion. And I heard Bishop Gavin Ashenden just speak the other day about the issue, and for him it hit home when it reached 6 million a few years back. He heard the 6 million and he recognized that as the Holocaust number. So for many of us, I think it's getting to know the scale of it.
Yes.
And 1 in 3 women have at least one abortion in their lifetime in the UK. And so just seeing this is not a fringe thing, this is not just for extreme cases, this is happening a lot. So that kind of began to wake me up, somewhat. And then also just very close to home, we knew someone who had an abortion, who had actually deliberately got pregnant and changed her mind and deliberately aborted.
Right. At what stage did she change her mind?
It was quite quickly, actually. This was first trimester. And we sought, we would have adopted the child. We were pleading, praying, you don't need to do this. Unfortunately, we couldn't prevail. And that kid would have been the same age as ours. They would have been friends. And so that was where it really came home. This is a big issue out there, but it's also right next door, and it's here. And there was nothing in our society or in our kind of legislation that stops someone from doing that.
Right.
They can choose to create, they can choose to destroy, and our country supports that.
Right. And it sounds like playing God at that stage, doesn't it? I kill and I make alive is God's role, right? And yet we are doing that, and I wonder whether actually having children of your own was a kind of a tipping point, because when you would do anything for this little bundle of gorgeousness,
that's right,
and then the idea that you would put to death 9 million of them.
Yeah, I mean that's it. You go for your 12-week scan, and they talk about it as your baby, and you look at your baby and you see the baby moving around, and there is, at that moment for many fathers and mothers, that's when you see your child, and no one thinks of it differently from that. That's when you see your child, and yet at exactly the same stage, most abortions happen around that stage. They're being dehumanized and mistreated, and that's when it really hits home for many. Yeah.
So we've had John Wyatt on the program as well, professor of neonatal science. And he was saying, the language changes entirely if the one thing that the clinician needs to know is this a wanted pregnancy? And if it's a wanted pregnancy, then you talk about baby. If it's not a wanted pregnancy, then you talk about the pregnancy is progressing. Which is just an extraordinary doublespeak, isn't it? You know. No one's ever said to my wife when she's expecting, how's that bundle of cells? How's that product of conception? Has it kicked yet?
Absolutely.
We say baby because we know there's a baby there. So how are things developing then? You got involved with an organization called Abort 67, is that right?
That's right. So Abort 67 is a project of the Centre for Bioethical Reform UK, and as the Lord was kind of, I guess, bringing this issue to the surface for me, a big step forward was getting to know the work of CBR and their project Abort 67, because up until that point I'd never really seen pro-life work. I'd never seen anything changing people's minds, change their behavior with the issue. So a friend of mine told me he was going out with what sounded like some kind of picket on the streets, and I didn't really like the sound of it. I thought this sounds awful. You get these sort of flashes of the sort of American stereotype: angry, aggressive,
megaphone,
pointless kind of protesting. And so, to be honest with you, I went out there to haul him off the streets. I thought this is not going to be nice, but I went out there, and straight away it made sense to me. And in fact, I got involved with the team there and then. I started handing out the literature, talking to people on the streets, and all they're doing is showing the reality. They show pictures of living babies in the womb, and they show the picture of victims of abortion, babies who've been killed by abortion. And it's showing the truth, and it's engaging people. It's saying, what do you think? What do you think about abortion? And we speak to people one-to-one. We're not there with a megaphone or slogans. We're not there, abortionists and murderers. We don't go down that route. We just show the facts and we engage people.
And the location where you do that, is that outside of clinics, or it's just anywhere in the high street?
It's a mixture. So increasingly we're going for strategic sort of locations like Parliament, Department of Health, recently Amnesty International, because they're a human rights organisation, but they're pushing abortion really hard in Ireland and other places. So sometimes it's strategic places like that, but sometimes it is also outside clinics, whether that be abortion centres like in Brixton, where hundreds, if not I think thousands a year are performed. But increasingly abortions are also being delivered within GP clinics.
Right.
The early abortion pills can be accessed from your local GP often. Yeah. And so part of what we're doing is showing people outside the clinic what's happening inside the clinic. We're taking the walls off the clinic,
right,
and showing what's happening inside.
So you went there to haul your friend off the streets, but as soon as you got there, what were your impressions?
I felt instantly comfortable with the way in which this is truth-based. This is not opinion-based. This is not feelings-based. It's truth-based. It is showing people the reality, and so often that's the missing ingredient. We know this because people have told us this. Even women who've had abortions often have had no idea about the development of the baby inside,
right,
or the details of the procedure. What actually happens in an abortion. And time again, I've had women say to us, if I'd seen that, I wouldn't have had my abortion. And occasionally, we don't often get this feedback there and then, but we have met women who've changed their minds there and then because of seeing and we've met some of those babies.
Right.
So we know that seeing the truth about abortion changes your mind about abortion.
Yeah. I was in a conversation online recently with a guy over one of the videos that we produced, and it went back and forwards. And I said in one of my comments, this is a difficult problem, but I don't think the answer is to dismember babies. And he came back and he said, why would you say dismember? That's such an emotive term. You're saying it like they're doing it maliciously. And I'm like, no, I'm literally describing medically. And if I added the adjective clinically dismembered the baby, would that be any better? And it wouldn't be any better. But simply to state the truth is horrific. It's too horrific for words. And it's too horrific to be seen. So that issue about truth is just so vital, is that people need to see and people need to be dealing in the truth.
That's right. And pictures of abortion and words about abortion, so long as they're accurate, can only ever be as shocking as abortion itself.
Right.
And so we hear this all the time, your shock tactics, emotive language. We are meticulous in our accuracy. Dismemberment isn't accurate. It is the removal of limbs, and that is exactly what's happening in the womb. And we've got pictures to go along with that. So it's accurate, and the truth is very uncomfortable.
Yeah. So Abort 67 has that sort of public-facing role, trying to change opinions on the streets and elsewhere. Yeah. Now, in the last year, you've kind of started up Brephos, which is very much facing the church and trying to say, hey, guys, let's wake up to this issue. So take me through some of that. Take me through, for instance, the name Brephos as well.
So the name Brephos is a New Testament Greek word. And
he's a classicist, people. Dave Brennan's a classicist.
I know. I've gone from uncool to even less cool. I did classics, and then I taught maths.
Wow.
Then I became an evangelist.
Oh my goodness.
And now I'm a pro-life advocate. So it's been a downhill.
It'll be traffic warden next.
So Brephos is literally, it means infant. It's a baby. What's interesting about the use of the word in the New Testament, the original language, is it's used of babies in the womb and babies out of the womb, born babies. So in Luke chapter 1, when we meet John the Baptist for the first time, leaping for joy in the womb, that's a Brephos, it's a baby. And then in Luke 2, Jesus lying in a manger, that's a Brephos, it's a baby.
Right.
And in fact, later on, when they bring children to Jesus to have them blessed, it's Brephos again, interestingly, which probably means they were very small children.
Yes.
Infants, not speaking yet. So, I mean, there's flexibility in the use of the word, but probably these were babies Jesus was blessing.
Right.
And they're all saying, don't waste his time on these babies. But he says, no.
Yes.
And he blesses them.
Utterly continuous with those in the womb.
Exactly.
Right.
So in God's eyes, biblically speaking, a baby is a baby is a baby. It doesn't matter if it's in the womb, just out of the womb, or a year down the line. Yeah. There's no difference in God's eyes.
Right. And there's no difference in common parlance either, unless you have this agenda.
Yes. And that's why I defend to the hilt the use of the word baby to speak about the unborn. It's not medically incorrect. When you go for your 12-week scan, they talk about your baby.
Right.
When you look on the NHS website, looking after you and your baby.
Right.
Don't smoke.
Right.
It harms your unborn baby.
Right. Yeah.
It's not scientifically incorrect.
Harry and Meghan are having a fetus.
Yes.
Fetus? Yeah. Are they having a fetus?
They're having a pregnancy, I think.
They're having a pregnancy. They're having a product of conception.
Yes.
Right.
A conceptus. A royal conceptus. Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting, I mean, I love language, and I see how it's being used and abused. And when people insist on using the word fetus and uterus rather than baby and womb, it is not medically incorrect, but it is deliberately dehumanizing the baby, and it's dematernalizing the mother. It's not a womb, because we all know wombs are for babies. No, it's a uterus.
Right. Yes. Clinical language.
Clinical. It just distances the humanity of the situation from us, and so
a Brephos.
A Brephos is a baby.
A baby from the womb.
That's right.
Out there into the world.
Yeah.
And therefore, and this organization, Brephos, is really trying to get the church to wake up to this issue.
That's right. I mean, the history of social reform is very interesting in this regard, because historically, if we look at the abolition of the slave trade, if we look at the civil rights movement, if we look at, we look at King Leopold's private colony at the Congo, and so often it is Christians who sound the alarm on social injustice and bring about change. And yet at the very same time, so often it is the mainstream church that's holding back reform. And often it's the mainstream church that is the last to change. So going back to the slave trade, the Church of England's missionary arm, the Society for the Propagation of Christian Religion in Foreign Parts, they owned a slave plantation. In fact, two in Barbados, the Codrington plantations, and they held on to them to the bitter end. And in fact, when the slave trade was abolished, they got a payout, they got compensation for the slaves they had to give up.
Yeah.
And so often it has been the case. Sadly, to our shame, I'm part of the church. To our shame, we're slow to respond to social reform, and there's a whole bunch of reasons, I think, behind that. But what it means is that the church is both our greatest opportunity and our perhaps greatest challenge in bringing about meaningful change on behalf of the unborn. we've got so much in our favor as the church. We've got an incredibly clear biblical account of the sanctity of life from conception. So we know why the unborn matter. We've got more science than ever to see the unborn in the womb from earlier stages, kicking around, and heartbeat from 3 weeks and all that. And we've also got a Savior and a Lord that we follow, who shows us that actually the way of the cross is normal.
Yes.
For the Christian, the way of suffering, the way of putting your own life down for the sake of others. We've got all the tools that we need. It's all there. Yeah. It's just, we've got to put them together somehow.
Yeah. I often say it's about Christmas and Easter. Like for me, why take this position on the unborn? Well, Christmas, we know that Jesus joined the human family from conception because Luke 1 says what is conceived by the Holy Spirit is preserved in the Creed. He joins the human family at conception. You can't really get around that. And therefore, how can we have any other view on life? And then you go to Easter, and you recognize from 1 Corinthians 1 that a theology of the cross says that we should value what is weak, what is vulnerable, what is dismissed, what is marginalized, because our God was crucified in weakness, it says in Corinthians. And so therefore, we are and ought to be those who do not have a theology of glory, a theology of the strong, the powerful, and the wise, but actually of the weak and foolish and despised and foolish-looking things in the world. And what could be more foolish-looking than what could be weaker than a child in the womb? And so from Christmas and Easter, you've got everything you need, to be pro-life. But then you're approaching churches and you're saying, let's make a noise on this issue.
That's right.
And what tends to, I mean, I'm sure you get some good responses and some not so good. What happens?
Yeah, well, I think, I say for a lot of people, there's just a kind of a lack of awareness here. They just don't know what abortion really is. They might have heard of it. They might know what the party line is, but so for some, there's just there's an education opportunity. But once we get through all of that, we then face a whole load of often deeper problems. What does it really mean to be a Christian? What is the church? How does the church interact with society? And for many, the idea of charity comes quite easily. No one's going to complain if you're running a food bank or you're alleviating poverty, and all this stuff's really important, and we should be doing it as Christians. But no one's going to pin you against the wall for that. But when you start standing up against something in society, as with the slave trade, as with the civil rights movement, there you're going to get some conflict, you get some resistance in the church as well as outside. And I think perhaps it's especially in the British culture, it's not in our temperament generally to stand up and confront. It's kind of not in our vocabulary. And that's, I think, the great challenge for the church is we know the unborn are living human beings. We know they're precious in God's sight. We know what abortion does to them. Increasingly, people know about this. And so now what will we do? Will we love our reputation more? Will we love our comfort more?
Will we love not making others uncomfortable? Because that's just not on, is it? And it's increasingly not on because you need a trigger warning, and people need safe spaces, and there's the coddling of the American mind, as Jonathan Haidt's reminded us of. And we are increasingly fragile, aren't we? And increasingly, if you make me feel uncomfortable,
that's right,
you have done something wrong.
That's right. And we do need to be mindful of people's feelings, their background, and certainly whenever I'm in a church, I will preface things and give warning before getting on to the tough stuff. And it's always by permission. If I'm showing an image, I say, look, this is going to happen. Here's why we're going to do this. You don't have to look at this. You can close your eyes. You can, there's no coercion here, but we want to show it. And here's why, because it changes minds and saves lives. So it's important that we're sensitive where we as far as is possible. But if it was toddlers that were being killed in their hundreds every day, would we care more about the feelings of the adults involved in that process than about the lives of the toddlers? I hope we wouldn't be.
Yeah.
And what's the difference?
Yeah.
And I think the difference is that we have unwittingly been persuaded to some degree the unborn don't really count. They don't really matter. Okay, yeah, technically as Christians we believe whatever, but in reality, do we really value them the way God values them? Because I think if we did, we wouldn't stop worrying about the feelings of others, of the adults. But I can't think that it's a Christian way of thinking or a Jesus-like way of thinking to care more about the feelings of adults than the welfare of little children.
What would you say to, let me sort of play devil's advocate and ask you questions that sometimes I'm asked. If there's a let's say a fertility clinic burning to the ground, and in one room there are, let's say, 100 frozen embryos, and in another room there's a toddler. And you can only go into one of those doors and save people from one of those two rooms. Isn't your instinct to save the toddler rather than save the 100 frozen embryos? Aren't you therefore basically implicitly saying that the unborn are not fully human?
I mean, if I were to choose between saving my own mother and a whole Indian city,
wow,
for sentimental reasons, I might choose my mother.
Yes,
and one, people may not criticize me for saving my mother. People might acknowledge, that's natural. That's that's your mum.
I understand the intuition.
Yeah. Right. And so, I mean, I'm not, the honest truth is I'm not sure what I would do in that situation. I would seek to save as much human life as possible. Obviously, a toddler might have a better chance of surviving outside of the context of the clinic burning down than embryos. I don't know. But my answer to that question doesn't change who or what they are.
Yes.
Just as me saving my mum isn't because that Indian city isn't packed full of human beings.
Yes.
And so what we need to do is look at it objectively, because human rights is not circumstantial. Human rights is not attributed according to relationships, location, development. We hold that human rights are intrinsic, self-evident, they don't change. Your right to life is your right to life. And so, anyone's response to that very artificial question has no bearing on when a human being comes a human being. We need to approach that scientifically. As Christians, we need to approach it biblically.
On the biblical issue, what about when somebody says, okay, well, Thomas Aquinas, he was biblical, right? And he seemed to think that life sort of began at quickening. And that's like 6 weeks, is it? Something around there. And that some will say that the modern pro-life position is actually quite novel in the history of the church. Is who is right? Was Thomas Aquinas the blip, or are we the blip? What's going on?
I've had people put this to me. And the question I asked in response, they were saying, when does ensoulment happen? When does the soul arrive? And that surely is the point from which human life really matters. And my response was another question. I said, where in the Bible is there any suggestion that you can have a living human being without a soul? I don't think that's something the Bible can conceive of. Human beings have mind, body, soul. That's what a human being is. And we see that even in Psalm 51. David goes as far back as conception. I was sinful from the moment my mother conceived me. Now, you need to be a person to be sinful.
Right.
You can't just be a bit of tissue or an organ, or a person can be sinful. And David says he was sinful from conception. He was a person. He must have had a soul. So I think Psalm 51 challenges that very directly. But even if we didn't have Psalm 51, just this idea, because we know scientifically they're living human beings before that. We know that, in terms of their DNA is distinct from the mother, distinct from the father. All the information is captured at fertilization. From that moment, they're just developing. And at 6 weeks, you've already got a heartbeat. You've already got many of the organs. You've already got the brain waves are measurable. At that point, we know there's a human being in there. And I can't imagine where someone gets the idea you can have a human being without a soul in them.
Yes. Yeah. So Aquinas is wrong.
Aquinas is wrong, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Or to put it more generously, we've got science now to show that I mean, quickening means coming alive. We've got evidence now of life from fertilization scientifically that he didn't have access to, and so I've not studied him in depth, but perhaps if he had access to the science we've got today, maybe it would be obvious to him too.
Okay, one more devil's advocate question. So there is this sort of a moral dilemma, sometimes known as the sort of the violinist kind of objection. So imagine that it's a woman who wakes up, and somehow this violinist who has some kind of need for dialysis or some kind of need for to be attached to her body, he is parasitic upon her, and she wakes up and she's now connected to him. If she removes him from herself, he will perish and die. Is she morally obligated to stay attached to him for, let's say, 9 months? What should she do? And could we ever blame her if she wanted to detach that violinist from her?
So it's a really great question, and analogies are fine. It doesn't have to be identical to be valid. The question is it an appropriate analogy? And at a number of points, I think it's actually not. Firstly, if I was standing on the street and a child walked past me, someone else's kid, and walked around the corner and something bad happened to them, say they got hit by a car, people would not hold me accountable. Why? Because it's not my kid. That's just a stranger. However, if it was my own child, say it was a 3-year-old, and say I walked into a shop and just left my 3-year-old out there, because I only wanted to get something sorted, and I come back and she's been abducted, or something's happened to her, rightly I'd be held accountable.
That's negligence.
It's negligence. But it's negligence because it's my own child. And we all intuitively know, and there's a legal distinction between your obligations to your own child, your offspring, and your obligations to a stranger. And one way in which this analogy breaks down is, I don't know how people's sort of biology is, but this isn't where babies come from. They aren't randomly strapped to you overnight. They're your offspring. And that leads me on to, I guess, a second point, that there's a difference in relationship. Your own child, you have certain obligations, a duty of care, and we've established already that it's a living human being. They're already your child. You have a duty of care. But that leads on to another point, which is, where do babies come from? They don't come out of thin air. And yes, there is the very difficult, and thankfully, at least in this country, very rare comparatively, case of rape, where it is not the product of consensual sex, but the overwhelming majority is the product of consensual sex. That's where babies come from. And so it's not like this thing is just strapped to you against your will. Nothing you did to make that a possibility or a likelihood. Babies come from sex. And so it is a baby is a natural consequence of sex, which is overwhelmingly consensual in the cases which lead to abortion in this country. And that would lead again to another point, which is the womb is the natural environment for a baby to develop in. Now, the analogy you give me, the violinist, it's a very unnatural, very strange scenario, which, in today's world, we can imagine it may be happening. Science has moved on to such an extent that, perhaps, someone could keep someone else alive if they got a special blood type or whatever, and so on. So I'm not saying that couldn't exist. I'm saying it's not really what pregnancy is like.
Yes. Yeah.
That's artificial. Pregnancy is ever so natural. It's where we all came from. We all grew up in the earlier stages in that womb, the natural place. And so whilst the violinist story talks about an unnatural way to keep someone alive at personal cost, pregnancy is absolutely natural. And the unnatural thing to do is to break entry into the womb, the place of safety and development for the youngest of our society, and kill them. That's the unnatural thing. That is the invasion. That's the intervention.
Yes.
Letting nature run its course is really very different.
Yes. And when you use that language of intervention, obviously a lot of the pro-choice argument is framed around bodily autonomy. And a woman's right to choose, but specifically her rights over her own body.
Yes.
And how do you break that kind of stranglehold of that language around bodily autonomy?
Yeah, it's a great question. the idea of bodily autonomy, it sounds great, so long as we don't begin to think about the bodily autonomy of the baby, the rights of the baby. And like so many pro-choice arguments, if we want to call them that, they assume what they need to prove. They assume the baby doesn't count. They assume the baby doesn't exist, whatever. And then, of course, I mean, if the baby doesn't exist, who the hell am I to talk to them about what to do with their own bodies? I mean, it's like telling a woman what she can't do with her hair or how to dress. I mean, who am I? But if the unborn is a living human being, it's extremely different. My bodily autonomy cannot be exercised to the extent where I kill another human being. And we all acknowledge that in other contexts. But it's all about the nature of the unborn. If the unborn is a living human being, my preferences, or if I want to call them my rights, cannot be extended to the point that they're robbed of their right to life, which is the fundamental human right. It comes first, because without it, nothing else can be.
Yeah. Oh man, I saw an advert for veganism the other day, and it had a picture of a cow on it, and it said, "It's not a personal choice if somebody dies." Right. So very interesting. You know, the vegan is thinking, they've often heard people say, "Well, it's my choice. I quite like beef burgers." But they're saying it's not a personal choice if someone gets to die, and you just think, well, there's another cause that could use that could use that slogan, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. And I've got all respect for vegan animal rights activists. I like their style, I have to say. And if I believed there was no morally significant difference between humans and animals, I'd be out there with them. Yeah, they are proclaiming the truth. They're showing the reality of the lives and deaths of these animals, and the only reason I'm not out there with them is that theologically I see a difference between humans and animals. But they're absolutely right. If the cows are somebody, it's not somebody's choice.
If the premises are true, the conclusions follow. Very good. So it does seem like, for want of a better phrase, a watertight case for the rights of the unborn. They are members of the human family and deserving of all protection and provision, and yet we are killing them 42 million, or 41.9 million. What's 0.1 of a million between friends? But 41.9 million, they reckon, were killed last year through abortion. You raise that with the church, and what kind of response do you get?
It's a real mixture. I just came down from Newcastle, and I was sharing with a fraternal there, a meeting of pastors, and it was the kind of meeting you hope for and pray for. People who, to some degree or other, I guess, were already notionally there, but hadn't seen the facts before, hadn't seen the stats. And really, I was drawing from the example of Bonhoeffer and Esther. Actually, biblically, Esther goes before the king and pleads for her people, the Jews, and that was by her courage and people's fasting and praying. That was the Holocaust that didn't happen. Bonhoeffer, millennia later, stands up very bravely against the Nazi regime, and very early on, 1933, 2 days after Hitler became Chancellor, he goes on public radio and denounces him. Very courageous. But the majority of the church, the German Lutheran Church, capitulated, signed off the Aryan paragraph within the year, and Jews weren't allowed to be pastors or hold office in church. And what I found is it's much easier to see it back there in history. We all look back and we think how awful that the German church capitulated and how wonderful that Bonhoeffer stood up against the evil. It's harder to see it in ourselves. And that's part of the human condition. We always find it easier to see the speck in the other eye and not the plank in our own. And so, we've got to be compassionate and gracious with that. We've all got that problem. But what was encouraging this meeting up in Newcastle was seeing pastors say, do you know what? We need to be speaking out about this. We need to stand up. We need to make a noise. We need to be like Bonhoeffer was. And that was wonderful for me. I saw a pastor just yesterday in London, big church, main sort of flagship church in London. And he watched something we put out there about the reality of abortion, in fact, how to teach on it on a Sunday morning. He watched this video, and his response was, I saw it and I wept. And that, to me, is the appropriate response. For someone who's got the love of Christ in their hearts, how can we look at this and not weep? And so we get some responses like that, and he's going to go on and teach his church about abortion, which is wonderful. But then sadly, we also get a lot of resistance. For a lot of people, it jars with their very notion of church. That they, whether I think probably not deliberately, I think unwittingly, something that's crept up on much of the church is a way of doing church where anything that has any friction, anything that confronts the culture, is taboo and it doesn't belong. And it's not welcome here
because you'll scare the horses.
That's right. Mm-hmm. It's where the church has become a bit more sort of a little bit more like a business, if I can put it like that. A bit more of a sort of we think a lot about the brand, about attracting people, about the aesthetic, and all that stuff is fine in its place. I'm an evangelist by nature. I have a heart for the lost, and I want to see people coming in. But when that becomes the top thing, when it becomes an idol. There's no space for stuff that threatens that. And for some people, their notion of church cannot accommodate something which is just a bit uncomfortable.
Yes. We don't want to cause friction. Yes, don't talk about this. We're British.
Yeah.
And it's just human nature, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not horrified by images of abortion, there's something psychopathic about you, obviously. So you say you're an evangelist. How do you put together this very much it's a human rights crusade, it's a social justice issue of our day. So social justice is not the same thing as the gospel.
Yeah. Correct.
So how do we put together wanting to be evangelistic and wanting to stand up for this human rights issue?
Yeah, great question. And the first thing I'll say is there is no inherent contradiction between those two things. Perhaps I'll come back to that. But the reason there's no contradiction between these two things is they are both commands of God. Now, God will never tell you to do something that will cause you to break another of his commands. It cannot be. God cannot ask you to do one thing which causes you to sin, to break one of his other commands. We are told to evangelize, absolutely. Matthew 28, Great Commission, go out and make disciples. But it's interesting to me the language of disciple is used there, not just converts. And what is a disciple? A disciple is someone who walks as Jesus walked. A disciple is someone who puts into practice all that Jesus taught. And earlier in Matthew's Gospel, it's interesting, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you're the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth, and you can almost hear the disciples kind of getting a bit puffed up. Fantastic, we're it. What's the next thing Jesus says? He says, well, don't get me wrong. This is not a sort of a license to do whatever you like. The law still stands. I've not come to abolish the law. Just before you get carried away. The law stands. Anyone who obeys the law and teaches others to do the same will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Anyone who breaks the law and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And he says that right after he talks about shining the light and all that kind of stuff. So in Jesus' ministry, there is no contradiction here, but they're both commands of God. We're to go out and preach the message, but with a view to making disciples. And preaching and teaching are only ever a means to an end. And the end is to make disciples to the glory of God. And a disciple is someone who walks like Jesus. So there is no contradiction here. And we are called to do both. They're not the same. Being pro-life is not the same as evangelizing, but they're both commands of God.
And have you seen how the two can go hand in hand, how they can serve one another? Certainly in my own evangelistic ministry, when I talk to people about the reality of judgment, people are like, really? Have we done anything that would really incur the wrath of God? And if you're able to say, well, we do kill 800 babies every working day in this country. Yeah. What do you reckon? Do you get angry about that? And if not, that's a problem in itself. Do you see ways where the pro-life cause can serve evangelism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've touched on this already, but I think somehow or other, something that's crept up on perhaps especially the British church, I don't know, is this idea that evangelism works best when everyone likes us, when we never rock the boat, we never confront the culture, we never upset, we never offend. Now, first off, I can't see that being a biblical way of seeing things. Jesus was extremely offensive. In fact, there's a place where his disciples come up to him and say, "Teacher, don't you realize they were offended when you said?"
I don't know if you noticed this, Jesus, but
and Jesus pretty much says, "What of it?" I mean, he says, "Look, if the blind lead the blind, they both fall into a pit." You know, Jesus was really quite comfortable with being offensive where necessary. It even talks about his opponents being humiliated. You know, now don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about humiliating people, certainly not intentionally, and certainly our aim is not to humiliate people who've had abortions. We've got a gospel that's big enough for abortion, and our message is one of grace and compassion for those who've had one, because, you know, we're all the same. I'm a sinner, regardless of whether I've had an abortion. I need the cross. And that's the message we've got for people. Whatever you've done, turn to Christ, and there's forgiveness. So this is not about bashing women, which is how some people think is the only way this can be done. So yeah, there's this idea that you know, we must be nice in order to evangelize. I just question that. I don't see that in the Bible. I don't see it in the apostles. Most of them ended up being killed for what they were doing. You know, you don't kill nice people. You know, you kill people who offend you deeply. So so that I would question, but also in my own life, anecdotally, some of the best conversations I've had in recent years, evangelistically, have started as questions about, well, what did you do today? You know, what's your work? What's this new job I hear you've got? And I always sort of think inside, oh, I don't want to go there today. You know, we have that natural sense, this is not good. We don't talk about this. You know, this is going to be uncomfortable. You know, people are going to get angry, and sometimes they do. Sometimes it is very raw, but I found, especially in the one-to-one, a context where actually this issue, which is very personal for many, and everyone's got their opinion, it provides a context which leads quite naturally to, well, you know, who chooses what's right and wrong? Is there forgiveness? I spoke with one friend, a good friend, a girl. She's not a Christian, and she wanted to know about our new work, and I said, well, I'm trying to help churches to talk about abortion. And she said, oh, what do you mean, like to get them to like be more accepting of it? And so I kind of explained, well, you know, we want to accept people, but we at the same time don't want to accept an action which causes harm to people. And as we spoke, we were able to draw the distinction which was needed. And in fact, what she was crying out for, I found, was what she was really asking was not, is abortion acceptable? Am I acceptable?
Yes.
Can I be accepted? Or can my friend be? Or my sister? Or whoever it is who's had an abortion?
Yes.
Are you preaching a message that rejects those people? Or have you got a message that accepts them?
Yeah. How can we do better at that? Because I think that's hugely important. As we prophetically speak into this issue, how do we also speak graciously to those who've been swept up in this evil, and to say that the arms of Jesus are open for you? How do we do that?
Yeah, look, it's not easy, because the pro-abortion lobby has been really quite successful in framing the issue. And our silence has allowed them to get away with framing the issue. And so what they've done, and what will take just a bit of work to kind of unravel and kind of remake, is they have pitched this as a women's rights issue, as a feminism issue. And so what they've done is they've arranged it so that someone like me must be anti-women. And of course, that's not our message. In fact, the evidence is mounting and is out there and is accessible. The evidence is out there for how damaging abortion is to women, psychologically, physically. The evidence is mounting. Some of it's undeniable. Some of it's still contested. Some of it we're still not sure. An example of what's not contested is if you have an abortion, your risk of your next pregnancy ending in a preterm birth, premature or seriously premature, goes up vastly. I mean, we're not talking about negligible increase, serious increased risk. No one denies that. Some are more contested. It's harder to see causality, etc., of other things. But the truth is, abortion is not good for women, and I say that absolutely. Abortion is not good for women, but because of our silence over so many years, we've allowed the other side to paint the picture. Women need abortion. Abortion liberates women, and so we come along and we say, "Hang on, it sounds like we hate women." So we have to do a bit of work to rewrite sort of reframe the issue. But I found it, especially in the one-to-one conversations where you've got the space to do that and you can listen and listen well, you can help people to see, look, what you're talking about here is not trying to put women back in the kitchen. What you're talking about here is an act of violence against a vulnerable human being is no good for them, and it's no good for their mother.
Yeah. Like both lives matter is such a brilliant slogan.
Yeah, I love that.
Don't you think?
Yeah.
Both lives matter. It's
exactly.
Genius, absolute genius.
So once we've cleared the ground on that, we get onto the gospel pretty naturally, actually, because we're talking about why all human beings matter, the fact that all of us are sinners, and we're all a part of this problem. I'm a part of the abortion problem,
right?
Because what have I done to promote a society in which women are valued, in which marriage is held high, and in which women are not left with that as their only option, which is what so many of them tell us.
Yes.
I had no choice.
Yes.
That's why I had an abortion.
Yes.
So we're all part of a society that leaves women with this as what they think is their best option.
How do we then build a culture of life in our churches that goes beyond, placarding an abortion clinic, but that actually will be open to the single mum who wants to come in and in a difficult situation raise children? And I'm sure there's all sorts of areas where we can do better to have a culture of life in churches. What should we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I was speaking with a German friend of mine recently, and people from different contexts often see things more clearly than we do. And she said, the thing about the UK is it is really a shame culture. And I think we've got a job in the church to create something that is not a shame culture. Because I genuinely dread to think how many abortions have happened in churches because of the shame of a pregnancy, say, outside marriage.
Yes.
Now, I believe sex outside marriage is a sin, but it's not unforgivable. And I mean, come on, half the Bible was written by people who, King David not only committed adultery, he killed to cover up that adultery. And I just think that our grasp and our proclamation of the gospel is really stunted. If we've got churches where you can't say, "Hey, look, I'm pregnant. Would you pray for me?"
Right. Yeah. We would be so shocked and clutch our pearls so much that the woman would rather go to the clinic.
Right.
Than face that shame.
Right. And that is a big shortcoming that we need to face. And we're all part of it. I'm part of it.
Yeah.
So in that context, where we're talking about, hey, I'm a sinner, I made a mistake, but God's bigger than that. I'm forgiven. I'm healed. I can talk about it. In that context, the teenager who gets pregnant out of wedlock or whatever, they're in a culture where you can talk about this stuff. You're not an absolute reject. You're not the only sinner in the house. Because we're talking about real life sins from the front, real life forgiveness, real life healing, and all of a sudden we've got this culture where it's actually okay for her to put up her hand and say, do you know what, I made a mistake here, but would you pray for me? Would you help me with this pregnancy? And the church celebrates the life of that baby as another human being made in the image of God wonderfully, and sees in that a beautiful story emerging.
So teaching from the front that fosters a culture in which you can be open about these things, fostering a culture of life. And do you have hope for the culture more widely? I mean, CBR wants to make abortion unthinkable, which is a great kind of... And I take it that CBR is wanting abortion to be unthinkable in the wider culture.
That's right.
Do you have hope for that happening?
Absolutely. We're hoping for that. We're working for that. We're praying for that. We want to see abortion made unthinkable and therefore end. We're in a self-governing country. It's a democracy. And we therefore will be held accountable to God for how we've led our own country as voters, and as abortion becomes seen for what it is, it protests itself. And interesting, I was in a church recently where I did a kind of a presentation on abortion, using the Good Samaritan really as the kind of passage. And I also showed some imagery. I showed some footage with permission and warning, etc., of abortion. A post-abortive woman said afterwards, every 16-year-old girl in the country needs to see that. And I said it already, time and time again, people say to us, if I'd seen that, I wouldn't have done it. So we've got to take the truth of abortion to society. That means in the schools, in the universities, in the public spaces. And if we're willing to stand up and talk about it and show it for what it is, it will become unthinkable. This is the history of social reform. If it's seen, it protests itself, and that's the beginning of the end. Mm-hmm. So we're absolutely working for that, and we think the church needs to be a key part of that. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine was saying that in the Second World War, after the Second World War, they asked Churchill when he started out, did you think you could beat the Germans? And Churchill said, no. We thought we could hold out for a while until the Americans got involved. And then together with them, we could beat the Germans. Mm. And that's a bit where we're at with the pro-life movement. Mm-hmm. Do we think we can end abortion? Well, we think we can hold out until the church gets involved. And together with the church, we can end abortion. Mm-hmm. God has endowed the church with enough resources to end abortion.
In what way? How? What do you mean?
If you get a few people standing on the streets, showing abortion, protesting, whatever, it can be ignored. If you get 1 million people marching the streets, people start to listen. The church still, no matter what anyone says, the church still has a great deal of influence if she'll only use it. I was working for a church before doing this full time, and Ipsos Mori, the survey, whatever research group, came around knocking on doors, trying to find out what people's radio listening habits were. And so I said, yeah, I'll do that survey for you. And they said, what do you do? I said, I'm a church minister. They said, did you know that puts you in the very top band of social influence? I thought they must be joking.
Right. Yeah.
But it's right. And I said, well, hang on, what's your criteria for influence? They said, well, a teacher isn't in it, but a headmaster is, a head teacher is. A doctor isn't in it, but a consultant is. I said, what's the criteria? They said, if you've got 50 people answering to you directly, we consider that to be you're in the top band of social influence. Now, where else are people meeting in their hundreds and thousands on a week-by-week basis to find out how to live their lives,
right?
What to think, what to say? The church is still a very influential place. Schools are often informed by their local church. Governors, especially the Church of England schools, we are influential if we'll only use it. We're not as big as we used to be, but if every Christian stood up on this, was willing to suffer, willing to lose their job for it, willing to take the flak for it, we can make a real racket on behalf of those who can't say a thing for themselves.
Right, absolutely, being a voice for the voiceless.
That's it.
So how can people get involved with Brephos and hear more from you?
Yeah. My email is dave@brephos.org.
Brephos is B-R-E-P-H-O-S.
That's it. Yeah. B-R-E-P-H-O-S. We will accept Roman scripts if you write it in Greek.
Yeah, that's right.
It might not
Beta Rome.
So brephos.org, come and have a look at our stuff. If you're a pastor or if you've got a church, we'd love to come and serve you in this way. We'd like to teach about abortion. We'd like to support you in teaching about it. We can connect you to all the pastoral ministries that will need to be accessed as a result of teaching on it. We've got post-abortion support for everyone. We've got a fantastic gospel-centered course for churches to use for the many in your congregation that have had abortions. And we can also connect you to crisis pregnancy centre support and all the different things that will come out of this. But it all starts with teaching. So if you're in a church that's not teaching regularly about abortion, would you get in touch with us and we'll help you on that journey.
Brilliant. We'll put that detail up online and people can hopefully get in touch. Right. Dave Brennan, thank you so much.
Thank you.